The dying light of Tyran's sun cast shadows across a world that no longer breathed, where cities stood empty as monuments to a silence deeper than death itself. In the void above, sensor arrays detected nothing. Not the absence of life, but something far more terrifying. The complete erasure of biological existence, as if an entire world's worth of biomass simply vanished into the hungry dark. The orbital survey revealed atmospheric composition normal for human settlement, gravity within acceptable parameters, even traces of industrial pollutants suggesting recent habitation. Yet bioscanners registered absolute zero. Not bacterial remnants, not organic compounds that should persist after extinction events. Nothing. As if life itself had been surgically excised with precision that spoke of intelligence beyond human comprehension. In the endless shadow of the Imperium, truth rots quietly. When you hear this tale, tell me, did it haunt you? Or should I whisper darker things next time? Inquisitor Fidus Kryptman stood aboard the bridge of his vessel, watching readouts that defied every precedent in his 40 years of service. The data scrolled across his command lectern like funerary scripture, each line confirming what his mind refused to accept. This was not war's aftermath, not rebellion's scorched remains. This was methodical consumption that treated 50 million souls as mere calories, processed with efficiency that made his skin crawl. Age had been kept from him by juvenile treatments, but tonight the viewport reflected a man older than his bones, pupils reflecting cold fire as he stared at a world stripped to sterile rock. We pause here in this moment of cosmic horror to address you, dear listener, for we truly love and care for each of you who joins us in these dark hours. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. The first reports had come from frontier settlements along the eastern fringe, scattered worlds serving as humanity's farthest outpost beyond Ultramar. Tyran had been unremarkable by imperial standards, a mining colony extracting precious metals to feed the war machine. The last transmission from the planetary governor had been routine bureaucracy. Then silence. Not sudden cut-off suggesting attack, but gradual fading that implied something insidious. Tech adepts worked desperately to explain their instruments' testimony. Magos Dragmor, cybernetic implants whirring with computational effort, had run bioscanner diagnostics 17 times, each confirming what his human mind rejected. The planet should teem with microscopic life, inevitable after billions of years evolution and thousands of years human habitation. Instead, sensors detected organic matter so sparse it registered as statistical noise. Standing in crimson-tinted observation light, Kryptman felt the first cold touch of fear that would define his unnaturally long life. He was no stranger to terror. The Inquisition trained agents to face horrors that shattered lesser minds. But this struck something primal in human consciousness, ancestral memory of being prey in a universe filled with predators. Whatever consumed Tyran was not content with conquest or destruction. It hungered for something fundamental, striking at the essence of existence itself. The implications cascaded through his mind with avalanche logic. If something possessed capability to strip worlds of biological matter with such thoroughness, humanity faced unprecedented threat. Orcs were savage but predictable. Chaos was insidious but self-defeating. Eldar were dangerous but few. This approached existence with harvesting machine methodology. His training demanded immediate report to Ordo Xenos, following established protocols for new alien threats. But instincts honed by decades in darkness whispered warnings about panic such reports would cause. The Imperium had faced many enemies, never one erasing worlds without leaving corpses. The concept challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare, survival, humanity's cosmic place. In terrible clarity, Kryptman made his first transformative decision. He would investigate before sounding alarms, seek understanding before unleashing imperial paranoia. Wisdom and caution birthed this choice, but it proved the first step down paths, leading him to become humanity's savior and greatest monster, architect of victories costing more than defeats. The crew awaited orders, unaware their commander balanced billions of lives on nascent decisions. To report meant crying wolf to deaf galaxies, risking authority and precious time needed for comprehension. To delay meant shouldering knowledge's terrible burden, while silent pestilence potentially spread unchecked. He closed his eyes, seeing not Tyran's image, but its intention. Harvest engineered to leave nothing, will expressed as pure appetite. When he opened them, grim resolve hardened his features. The path ahead promised darkness, impossible choices, unimaginable sacrifices. He would walk it because he must. In dying starlight, where hunger waited with infinite patience, one man began his transformation from Emperor's servant to something far more complex and dangerous. His journey into damnation, disguised as duty, had begun. The silence that followed Tyran's discovery clung to Kryptman's ship like a shroud, seeping into every corridor and sanctum until even the most hardened crew members spoke in whispers. 3 months of clandestine investigation had transformed the Inquisitor from respected servant of the Emperor into something his colleagues observed with growing unease. His requisition requests grew increasingly bizarre. Xenobiology texts from forbidden archives, deep-range reconnaissance vessels equipped with bioscanners, clearance to interview survivors from worlds that officially never existed. The Ordo Xenos began monitoring his activities with concern that bordered on alarm, noting behavioral patterns suggesting dangerous obsession with threats that defied classification. His private chambers aboard the strike cruiser Righteous Fury had become a shrine to mounting dread, star charts covering every surface like funeral shrouds. Red markers indicated vanished worlds forming constellations of hunger across the eastern fringe, each pin representing millions of souls reduced to statistical notation. Sleep had abandoned him entirely, replaced by fevered calculations attempting to predict the next feeding ground. His reflection in the viewport showed hollow cheeks and eyes burning with fanatic intensity, transformation that alarmed even trusted subordinates who had served him faithfully for decades. The man they knew was disappearing, consumed by knowledge too terrible for comfortable minds to accept. In the stratagem's crimson light, Magos Dragmor awaited beside an open stasis casket, mechadendrites poised in reverent dread above fragments recovered from Tandros. The mining world should have joined Tyran's silent brotherhood, yet somehow transmitted final moments before darkness claimed it. Pict feeds were fragmentary, corrupted by interference suggesting electromagnetic phenomena beyond Imperial understanding. But scattered frames revealed glimpses of nightmare made manifest. Creatures moving with purpose rather than animal hunger, bioforms adapting tactics mid-battle, swarms consuming not just flesh, but metal, stone, atmosphere itself. Most disturbing were silences between screams, moments when transmission continued but no sound emerged, as if the very concept of noise had been devoured. The artifact defied every precedent in Dragmor's vast archives. Chitinous plating the color of bruised twilight, ribbed with capillaries that pulsed when warmed, dead yet unwilling to concede mortality. Embedded 12 meters deep in liquefied rock, It spoke of impact forces that violated physics while displaying biological impossibilities. Carapaces harder than ceramite, acid capable of dissolving adamantine, reproductive cycles that mocked conservation of mass. Most troubling was evidence of collective intelligence operating beyond individual organisms, coordination suggesting hive mind capabilities that made Orc-War energy seem primitive by comparison. These were not beasts driven by instinct but components of larger organism, treating entire worlds as single meals. Krypton's first attempt to share findings with fellow Inquisitors met reception bordering on hostility. The Vox Conclave assembled beneath his ship's astropathic choir, where thought could hide beneath transmission's thrum. Ghostly figures materialized around the hololith. Lord Inquisitor Varro, with silvered skullcap and courtroom stare. Lady Nereth of Ordo Xenos, with eyes hollowed by old wars. An interrogator whose pilgrim scallop defied protocol. Even stripped of emotional rhetoric, his warnings were stark. Unprecedented Xenos threat, capable of consuming entire worlds. Varro's contempt sharpened the air like blade edge. Such theories bordered on heretical thinking, suggesting enemies beyond the Imperium's capacity to understand or defeat. Perhaps extended frontier duty had compromised judgment, requiring rotation to safer assignments where stress might not manifest as dangerous delusions. The confrontation marked Krypton's first taste of isolation that would define his remaining years. Colleagues who once sought his counsel now avoided his presence, uncomfortable with intensity radiating from him like fever heat. Requests for additional resources were denied, officially due to budget constraints, but privately because superiors feared his investigations were becoming unhealthy obsession. In their eyes, he was becoming liability rather than asset. Mind perhaps broken by horrors too vast for human comprehension. The Ordo Xenos maintained surveillance, watching for signs of corruption requiring intervention. Yet evidence continued accumulating despite official indifference. Scout vessels reported identical consumption patterns spreading across dozen worlds, each following methodology so precise it suggested engineering rather than natural predation. The creatures left traces of exotic biotechnology, organic constructs defying classification within established taxonomies. Most disturbing were genetic fragments incorporating elements from consumed species, with efficiency suggesting deliberate improvement rather than random mutation. These entities were not simply killing and eating. They were learning, adapting, evolving with each encounter, like some cosmic predator perfecting its hunting techniques across geological time. Standing before the great viewport, watching stars that might already be dying unknown deaths, Krypton faced his first great moral crisis. The evidence pointed toward threat requiring immediate galactic response. Mobilization of resources on scale not seen since the Great Crusade. But his isolation meant no one would listen. Warnings dismissed as madman's ravings. Conventional channels had failed, leaving him with terrible choice. Abandon investigation to preserve career and sanity, or continue down paths leading toward methods that would brand him heretic in eyes of those he served. The weight of billions of lives pressed against his conscience, their unborn screams echoing through probability calculations growing more dire with each passing day. In the darkness between stars, where hunger waited with infinite patience, Krypton made decision that would define the rest of his unnaturally extended life. If the Imperium would not listen to warnings, he would gather proof impossible to ignore. If survival required him to become monster in service of humanity's continuation, then monster he would become. The transformation had begun not with corruption or madness, but with clarity too terrible for comfortable minds to accept. The dawn over Thandros Prime arrived, stained the color of old blood, casting crimson shadows across the industrial sprawl where Commander Marcus Thorne had maintained vigilant watch for 15 years of faithful service. His weathered hands moved across the command lectern's tactical displays with practiced efficiency, reviewing defensive positions that had never faced threats beyond occasional pirate raids or cultist uprisings. The morning's first reports filtered through static-laden Vox channels, describing atmospheric anomalies that violated every precedent in Imperial records. Massive biosignatures descending without the heat signatures of conventional drop pods, organic forms riding gravitational currents with impossible grace. Through the command bunker's armored viewports, Thorne watched the sky darken with shapes that moved like living rain, each droplet a nightmare given flesh and purpose. The first wave struck Thandros with the methodical precision of a harvesting operation, rather than military assault. Creatures the size of men but moving with predatory focus that spoke of intelligence beyond animal cunning flowed across the defensive perimeter like a tide of chitinous death. Thorne's veteran guardsmen responded with disciplined volleys, lasfire carving crimson paths through writhing masses that should have collapsed under such concentrated firepower. Instead, the enemy absorbed energy weapons with biological impossibility, carapaces hardening against specific wavelengths within minutes of first contact. Most disturbing was their absolute silence. No battle cries or roars of rage. Only the wet sound of organic machinery operating at cellular level across organisms that treated warfare as feeding behavior. Through magnoculars, Thorne witnessed his soldiers discover that courage meant nothing against enemies immune to fear or pain. Sergeant Kozlov's squad held the northern approach with textbook precision, but the creatures learned from each engagement, sharing knowledge instantaneously across their entire force through some form of biological communication that defied Imperial understanding. Artillery barrages that should have devastated massed formations were absorbed by organisms that hardened their shells against explosive force, then redirected the energy into rapid cellular division that created new warriors from crater edges. The psychological impact was devastating as soldiers realized their every tactic was being catalogued, analyzed, and countered by an enemy that grew stronger with each battle fought. The horror deepened when Thorne realized the enemy was not simply killing his men, but incorporating them into something larger and more terrible. Fallen guardsmen rose with movements that remained recognizably human, yet fundamentally altered. Familiar faces bearing expressions of alien purpose, while retaining enough individual characteristics to be recognized by former comrades. They moved with hive coordination that spoke of consciousness subsumed into greater organism, tactical knowledge intact, but loyalty redirected toward incomprehensible goals. Former brothers in arms turned weapons against their units with surgical precision, creating hesitation that the enemy exploited with mechanical efficiency. Communications with Orbital Command became increasingly frantic as Thorne's situation reports painted pictures of defeat beyond conventional military understanding. The enemy adapted not just to weapons, but to doctrine itself, learning human tactical methodology and turning it against defenders with improvements that spoke of eons of practice. Airstrikes met flying organisms that engaged Imperial aircraft in aerial combat resembling deadly ballet. Bioforms demonstrating maneuverability that reduced veteran pilots to weeping frustration. Heavy weapons emplacements found their targets suddenly immune to munitions that had proven effective moments earlier. Organic armor evolving in real time to counter specific threats. Buildings were not destroyed by conventional explosives, but dissolved by corrosive secretions, their materials absorbed into the advancing swarm, rather than left as rubble. The enemy treated ceramite fortifications as digestible obstacles, reducing decades of military engineering to nutrients for incomprehensible appetite. Thorn watched his life's work dissolve into biological soup, while creatures the size of battle tanks descended from bioships like falling cathedrals, their massive forms bristling with weapons that fired living ammunition burrowing into defensive positions before exploding in showers of acid and bone fragments. In the bunker's deepest levels, Thorn faced his final transmission to Fleet Command, knowing his words would serve as last testimony for Thandros Prime's 40 million souls. The Voxcaster flickered with interference patterns suggesting the enemy was learning to disrupt Imperial communications, adding technological warfare to their biological arsenal. His report remained clinical despite personal horror. Enemy demonstrated adaptive capabilities beyond known Xenos classifications, tactical intelligence suggesting hive mind coordination, consumption patterns indicating complete biomass harvesting rather than territorial conquest. Most critically, they were becoming more dangerous with every engagement, treating human resistance as educational opportunity rather than obstacle. The transmission cut off as organic acids dissolved the communications equipment, but not before carrying Thorn's final warning into the void. Kryptman's vessel arrived 3 days later to find Thandros Prime stripped to bedrock, atmosphere thin as mountain air, oceans reduced to alkaline pools reflecting empty sky. The orbital survey revealed the same impossible thoroughness witnessed at Tyran. Complete biological erasure accomplished with efficiency that spoke of geological timescales of practice. In the silence of another dead world, the Inquisitor finally possessed undeniable proof of the threat approaching from intergalactic darkness, validation of every dark premonition that had driven him toward isolation and the terrible choices ahead. The silence aboard Kryptman's flagship had evolved beyond mere absence of sound into something approaching the vacuum of space itself, where thoughts echoed with hollow resonance against the weight of impossible mathematics. Thandros Prime's death had provided undeniable proof of the threat approaching from intergalactic darkness, but evidence carried burdens heavier than ignorance ever could. In his private sanctum, surrounded by holographic projections displaying the enemy's inexorable advance, the Inquisitor contemplated choices that would transform him from humanity's protector into its most necessary monster. The tactical displays showed 17 worlds already consumed, their positions forming a constellation of hunger, pointing directly toward the Imperium's most densely populated sectors, where billions lived in blissful ignorance of the appetite approaching through the void. His trembling fingers traced trajectories across star charts that had become prophecies written in light and shadow, calculating speeds that defied conventional understanding of interstellar travel. The enemy moved without warp drives, yet covered impossible distances, each consumed world providing biomass for acceleration through processes that violated conservation of energy while maintaining terrifying efficiency. The implications cascaded through strategic calculations like avalanche mathematics. Conventional evacuation remained impossible across such scales. Military resistance would only feed the enemy's exponential growth. Negotiation meant nothing when facing appetite incarnate. Only one solution presented itself with crystalline clarity that made his stomach clench with prophetic nausea, a cure more terrible than any disease. The first test of his emerging doctrine materialized with Baka Prime, an agricultural world housing 12 billion souls, whose only crime was existing in the projected path of cosmic hunger. Standing before the great viewport, watching the planet cities glitter like scattered diamonds against continental darkness, Kryptman felt the weight of godlike authority pressing against his conscience with crushing force. The mathematics were inescapable. 12 billion lives balanced against potentially trillions more. Arithmetic of survival that transformed mass murder into moral necessity through equations written in blood and strategic imperative. His staff watched with growing horror as their commander's transformation accelerated beyond recognition, driven by knowledge too terrible for comfortable minds to process. In the flag briefing chamber, beneath a ceiling painted with saints whose eyes seemed to refuse meeting his gaze, he made his case to Admiral Vorin of Battlefleet Tempestus. The weathered naval commander's profile resembled a cliff carved from iron, his voice carrying the authority of decades commanding the void. Kryptman presented trajectories and consumption rates, the arithmetic of vanishing oceans, and the necessity of establishing fire breaks measured in planetary annihilation. Vorin's silence stretched like a noose before his response came in measured ice. Authorization denied for extermination without conclave ratification. Populations to be relocated where feasible. Reminder that the Imperium does not destroy its own. Kryptman thanked him with grave courtesy, while feeling the floor tilt toward an abyss beneath his feet. Lady Nerith received him in a chapel where incense battled the smell of machine oil, her eyes the color of candle smoke, and twice as weary. She listened without interruption as he described culling worlds to save sectors, her hands folded like a verdict awaiting language. When he finished, she spoke softly, as one might to a patient bearing mortal wounds. "What you propose, Fidus, is a blade that will not stop cutting. Once drawn, it will expect blood forever." He told her about Thandros, about silence that swallowed names and hope alike. She nodded with infinite sadness, then refused formal endorsement while offering whispered protection. She would slow the Conclave's inevitable condemnation if he acted, but she would not sanctify methods that violated everything they had sworn to protect. The moral weight of preemptive genocide pressed against his sanity like physical force, each potential victim's face manifesting in fevered dreams that had replaced natural sleep entirely. On Helios Danum, an ocean emerald hanging in gentle starlight, he witnessed consequences incarnate. Wheat seas rolled like sleeping gold. Children raced along irrigation channels with wooden swords, pretending to be heroes they would never meet. In a market square, a girl handed him a paper flower, its petals smudged by sugar and innocence. He nearly told her she was merely a line in an equation, but mercy closed his mouth. He carried that silence away like a weight that would never lift. Communications with the Ordo Xenos had devolved into barely concealed hostility as his requests grew increasingly extreme. Lord Inquisitor Varro's latest transmission carried undertones of threat disguised by official courtesy, suggesting extended frontier duty had compromised judgment, requiring immediate psychiatric evaluation. The Imperium possessed protocols for dealing with rogue inquisitors whose authority exceeded their wisdom, measures that would strip him of power before implementation of strategies necessary for species survival. Time constraints meant choosing between personal redemption and humanity's continuation, decision that revealed the true cost of bearing knowledge too vast for institutional comprehension. In the depths of Night Cycle, surrounded by tactical displays showing enemy movement with mathematical precision, Kryptman made peace with his transformation from protector to destroyer. The man who had served faithfully for decades was dying, replaced by something harder and more terrible, a creature capable of ordering planetary genocide without flinching, because the alternative was universal extinction. Authorization codes flowed from his fingers with mechanical precision, each character sealing the fate of billions while potentially saving trillions through calculus that transformed mass murder into strategic necessity. In the silence between stars, where hunger waited with infinite patience, one man completed his metamorphosis into salvation's architect, accepting damnation as the price of species survival. The authorization codes flowed from Kryptman's fingers with the mechanical precision of prayer stripped of hope, each character sealing the fate of 12 billion souls, while his conscience screamed protest that duty had learned to silence. Cyclonic torpedoes awakened in their launch bays like slumbering angels of annihilation, machine spirits whispering litanies of destruction as they prepared to deliver salvation through genocide. On Baka Prime below, the morning carried ordinary promises. Children raced through wheat fields that rolled like golden seas. Lovers shared breakfast in hab blocks whose windows caught the dawn. Farmers checked irrigation systems that would never complete another cycle. In the agricultural districts, a girl named Elara helped her father tend crops that had grown for generations, their hands dark with soil that would soon become glass beneath the cleansing fire of necessity. The first torpedo entered atmosphere like a falling star that had forgotten mercy, shedding ablative prayers and heat shrouds until its heart opened to speak the language of finality. Across the planet's surface, life continued its ancient rhythms for precious seconds more. A teacher explained mathematics to students who would never need the knowledge. A medica attended patients whose ailments had become irrelevant. A priest offered morning benedictions to congregations whose prayers would be answered in ways they never imagined. The viral payload spread with efficiency that spoke of imperial engineering perfected through millennia of warfare, invisible death racing through atmospheric currents to embrace every living thing with equal tenderness. From the bridge of his flagship, Kryptman watched readouts that transformed 12 billion individual tragedies into statistical notation, biomass readings dropping toward zero with mathematical precision that validated strategies too monstrous for comfortable minds to accept. His staff observed their commander with expressions mixing horror and reluctant understanding, witnessing transformation from respected servant of the Emperor into something harder and more terrible. Captain Mordian approached with movements suggesting proximity to dangerous predator, reporting successful deployment while his weathered face bore scars from battles where enemies possessed comprehensible motivations and faces that could be hated rather than simply erased. The second wave of torpedoes arrived like punctuation marks in a sentence written across planetary scales, atmospheric ignition transforming breathable air into plasma storm that consumed everything capable of supporting biological existence. Cities became brief stars before collapsing into crater glass. Oceans boiled away to leave alkaline residue reflecting empty sky. Forests vanished into particulate matter that danced on thermal currents before settling into silence deeper than vacuum. Through filtered viewports, the crew watched their homeworld sister planet die with clinical thoroughness, each detonation erasing centuries of human achievement, while denying approaching hunger the sustenance it craved. Communications from the Ordo Xenos arrived with predictable swiftness, Lord Inquisitor Varro's holographic projection crackling with barely contained fury as he demanded explanation for unauthorized planetary genocide. The weathered Inquisitor's authority had been built upon foundations of moral certainty, now confronting subordinate whose actions defied every precedent in Imperial doctrine. Kryptman's response came measured and hollow, explaining firebreaks created through necessity, while knowing his words carried weight of terrible knowledge that transformed mass murder into strategic imperative. Varro's condemnation was swift and absolute. Immediate recall for formal inquiry. All command authorities suspended pending investigation of actions bordering on treason against everything the Imperium claimed to protect. The isolation that had begun with whispered warnings crystallized into complete severance from institutional support, leaving Kryptman alone with burden too dangerous for official channels to acknowledge. Lady Nereth's final transmission carried undertones of profound sadness as she withdrew protection previously offered, her influence insufficient to shield actions that violated fundamental imperial doctrine regarding sanctity of human life. His former colleagues viewed him with mixture of horror and pity, recognizing transformation from faithful servant into architect of salvation, whose methods would damn him in history's judgment, while potentially preserving humanity's future through arithmetic written in blood. In his private chambers, surrounded by star charts marking worlds that might require similar sacrifice, Kryptman confronted the true cost of bearing knowledge that exceeded institutional comprehension. Sleep had abandoned him entirely, replaced by calculations measuring billions against trillions, equations that treated individual existence as variables in formulas determining species survival. The man who had served faithfully for decades was gone, replaced by a creature capable of ordering planetary annihilation without visible emotional distress, because the alternative was universal extinction, measured on scales that dwarfed personal conscience. Long-range sensors confirmed the strategy's effectiveness as enemy bioships altered course to bypass the sterilized system. Massive forms drifting past dead worlds like cathedral bones, searching for sustenance that no longer existed. Victory achieved through genocide carried weight, heavier than any defeat. Mathematical proof that 12 billion deaths had purchased time for trillions more, while transforming their architect into guardian whose methods exceeded human moral frameworks. Standing before the great viewport where Bacca Prime hung like a coin too scorched to spend, Kryptman pressed a crushed paper flower against the glass, remembering innocence he could no longer afford, while accepting damnation as the price of species continuation in universe, where hunger waited with infinite patience for worlds to ripen into nourishment. The ice fields of Macragge's polar fortress gleamed like scattered diamonds beneath a dawn that carried promises of death, where Sergeant Castor of the 4th Company adjusted his grip on a bolter that had served him faithfully through 2 centuries of warfare, yet felt inadequate against shadows moving where no shadows should exist. The morning briefings had described creatures approaching from intergalactic darkness with methodical precision that spoke of intelligence beyond human comprehension. Yet nothing in his experience prepared him for warfare against appetite incarnate that would treat his legendary prowess as merely another variable to be adapted around. Through the fortress wall's armoured viewports, Macragge's surface stretched in pastoral beauty that belied the approaching storm. Rolling hills where chapter serfs tended crops that had fed heroes for millennia. Training grounds where neophytes learned arts of war that would be tested against enemies immune to conventional tactics. Monuments to fallen brothers whose sacrifices had meaning only if their legacy survived the hunger descending from intergalactic void. The first bioships appeared as distant stars that moved with purpose rather than celestial mechanics, massive forms drifting through vacuum with grace that spoke of organic engineering perfected across geological timescales. Long-range auspex revealed silhouettes resembling cathedrals grown from bone and sinew, their hulls pulsing with biological rhythms that suggested life rather than mere construction, weapon batteries that fired living ammunition capable of independent thought and tactical adaptation. Within the fortress monastery's strategium, Chapter Master Manius Calgar studied enemy formations with mind trained to recognize patterns in chaos, yet these creatures moved with coordination that transcended individual intelligence into something approaching divine consciousness, focused entirely upon consumption. His weathered features bore weight of command that had never faced threats beyond human understanding, while his tactical genius prepared strategies against foes that learned from every engagement and grew stronger through defeat. Orbital defense platforms engaged the approaching swarm with concentrated firepower that should have shattered conventional fleets. Macro cannons hurling shells the size of hab blocks into formations that absorbed damage with impossible resilience. The enemy bioships demonstrated adaptation capabilities that violated every precedent in Imperial records, their living hulls hardening against specific munition types within minutes of first contact, while returning fire with weapons that seemed to learn from each exchange. Most disturbing was their absolute silence across all Vox channels. No battle cries or tactical communications, only the wet sound of organic machinery operating at cellular level across organisms that treated warfare as feeding behavior rather than conquest. The psychological impact was immediate as warriors who had never known defeat realized their every strategy was being catalogued, analyzed, and countered by an enemy that grew stronger with each battle fought. The first wave of organisms descended through Macragge's atmosphere like rain, composed of living nightmares, each creature the size of a man, but moving with predatory focus that spoke of intelligence beyond animal cunning. Castor's squad opened fire with disciplined volleys that carved crimson paths through chitinous masses, bolt rounds exploding within alien flesh that should have collapsed under such concentrated firepower. Instead, the enemy absorbed damage with biological impossibility, carapaces hardening against explosive force, while acid secretions dissolved cover that had protected ultramarines for centuries. Most terrifying was their learning curve. Tactics effective against the first wave proved useless against the second, as if each fallen creature transmitted tactical data to its surviving brethren through some form of biological communication that defied Imperial understanding. Brother Sergeant Tellian's scouts reported enemy formations adapting to Codex Astartes' doctrine with efficiency that suggested prior study of human military methodology. Flanking maneuvers met creatures that had repositioned to counter such tactics before they were attempted. Ambush sites found enemies waiting in prepared positions. Heavy weapons emplacements discovered their targets suddenly immune to munitions that had proven effective moments earlier. The realization struck like physical blow. These creatures were not simply killing but learning, treating each engagement as educational opportunity while incorporating human tactical knowledge into incomprehensible appetite. Standing before tactical displays, showing enemy positions, Calgar understood his warriors faced not war, but predation on scales that dwarfed individual comprehension. From orbit, aboard his unmarked vessel, Kripman observed the battle with analytical detachment that masked growing horror at implications beyond immediate tactical concerns. The Ultramarines fought with legendary skill and courage, yet every victory served the enemy's ultimate purpose by providing data about human military capabilities. His calculations revealed terrible truth. Conventional resistance would only make the Tyranids stronger, teaching them to counter humanity's finest warriors while consuming resources necessary for species survival. The mathematics were inescapable, equations written in blood that transformed heroic sacrifice into strategic liability. Each fallen space marine represented not just individual tragedy, but intelligence gathered by enemies that would use such knowledge against future worlds, making every battle a tutorial in human warfare. In the fortress monastery's deepest vaults, Chaplain Cassius led prayers for brothers whose gene seed might not survive the coming storm, his voice carrying authority that had comforted dying warriors across countless campaigns. Yet tonight, his words felt hollow against an enemy that showed no recognition of human concepts like honor or mercy, creatures that consume not just flesh, but the very essence of existence with methodical precision that spoke of eons of practice. The bitter lesson emerged with crystalline clarity. Even the Emperor's finest could not simply fight this enemy through conventional means. Victory, if such word retained meaning, required strategies that transcended traditional warfare, methods that would transform defenders into something unrecognizable while preserving humanity's continuation through arithmetic, measured in worlds rather than individual lives. The dissection sanctum aboard Krypton's flagship possessed the hushed reverence of chapels built to house forbidden relics, its adamantine floors etched with ward circuits and binary prayers, while the air carried bitter incense of antiseptic, ozone, and machine oil blessed by ritual. Magos biologis. Xerath stood within the amber glow of stasis fields like a priest before an altar of damnation. Servo arms poised over specimens that defied every classification in his vast archives. The creature fragments had been recovered from Macrage's outer defenses at terrible cost, each sample worth more than battleships in terms of knowledge that could determine humanity's survival or extinction. His mechadendrites moved with surgical precision around chitinous plating that still pulsed with alien purpose despite separation from its host organism, while biometric scanners revealed genetic complexity that violated fundamental principles of evolution through natural selection. Krypton observed from the gallery like a shadow framed by runes of interdiction, his hands clasped to conceal trembling while his eyes consumed every datum with hunger of a man trying to stay ahead of an approaching tidal wave. The first revelation struck them both like physical blows, when cellular analysis revealed DNA structures incorporating elements from dozens of previously consumed species, genetic material woven together with precision that spoke of deliberate improvement rather than random hybridization. Under magnification that revealed molecular architecture, they witnessed biological machinery operating at scales where chemistry became philosophy. Organic computers processing information through genetic algorithms that treated adaptation as mathematical problems requiring elegant solutions. Most disturbing was evidence suggesting the creatures possessed racial memory encoded at cellular level. Accumulated knowledge from countless worlds distilled into instinctive understanding of warfare, survival, and consumption refined across geological timescales of practice. Xerath's mechanical voice carried undertones of barely controlled terror, despite augmented modulation, as he explained implications that challenged fundamental assumptions about life's nature and purpose. These organisms were not simply evolved predators, but components of larger system that treated entire galaxies as feeding grounds, biological constructs designed for infinite adaptation and exponential growth through consumption of lesser species. The second phase of analysis revealed horrors that transcended mere biological impossibility into realms where science became nightmare given substance and purpose. Genetic sequencing showed the creatures possessed ability to incorporate beneficial traits from consumed organisms within single generation. Evolutionary processes that should require millennia compressed into cellular divisions measured in hours rather than eons. a servo blade excised fragment of carapace. In the specimen tray, the sliver flexed like muscle remembering motion, while adapting to containment protocols in real time. Toxin applications met with biological countermeasures that developed within minutes, each chemical assault teaching the tissue new methods of resistance that would be shared across the entire species through incomprehensible communication networks. Standing in the laboratory's crimson-tinted light, surrounded by servo skulls that chanted binary prayers while recording observations, both men felt their consciousness strain against implications that isolated them from lesser mortals blessed with ignorance. The mathematical projections were inescapable. Conventional warfare would only accelerate the enemy's adaptation while providing biological material for exponential growth that would overwhelm Imperial defenses through sheer mass, rather than superior tactics. Every battle fought against these creatures provided them with intelligence about human capabilities, making resistance counterproductive unless conducted through methods that denied them such educational opportunities. Kripman's collaboration with the Magos produced understanding more dangerous than any weapon, knowledge that revealed the true scope of humanity's predicament. Long-range communications from Macragge confirmed their worst fears. Ultramarines' tactics that proved effective against initial waves became useless against subsequent assaults, as if each fallen creature transmitted tactical data to surviving brethren through biological networks that operated beyond individual consciousness. The enemy was learning not just from victory, but from defeat, treating every engagement as tutorial in human warfare while incorporating Imperial methodology into incomprehensible appetite. In the laboratory's deepest vault, where stasis fields contained specimens too dangerous for conventional storage, they witnessed ultimate horror, captured organisms that continued evolving despite isolation from their hive fleet, genetic material rewriting itself in response to containment protocols while developing countermeasures against Imperial technology. The creatures were learning even in death, biological computers processing tactical data through cellular networks that treated entire species as single organism, directed by intelligence that dwarfed human comprehension. The collaboration between flesh and steel, between Inquisition authority and Mechanicus knowledge, produced strategies that violated every precedent in Imperial doctrine, while offering humanity's only hope for survival against appetite incarnate. Their calculations revealed terrible arithmetic. Conventional military engagement would result in inevitable defeat through enemy adaptation. Evacuation remained impossible across galactic scales. Negotiation meant nothing when facing creatures that viewed sentient life as mere protein waiting to be harvested. Only one solution presented itself with crystalline clarity that made both men's souls recoil from its implications. Standing before specimen containers that held fragments of humanity's potential extinction, Kripman felt the final barriers of his moral conditioning dissolve under weight of cosmic necessity. The enemy's adaptive perfection demanded responses that transcended human frameworks, strategies that treated individual worlds as acceptable losses in equations determining species survival. In the silence of the laboratory, where captured nightmares pulsed with alien purpose, he accepted his role as guardian whose protection would require him to become monster in service of humanity's continuation. Architect of salvation whose methods would damn him in history's judgment, while potentially preserving the future through arithmetic written in blood and measured in planetary annihilation. The medic bay aboard the strike cruiser Eternal Vigilance carried the antiseptic silence of places where death was measured in heartbeats rather than centuries, its walls bearing purity seals that seemed inadequate against corruption that worked through love rather than hatred. Captain Aurelius of the Imperial Fist stood before the examination slab where Brother Sergeant Lycan lay in induced stasis, his weathered features peaceful in artificial sleep, while bioscanners revealed horrors that challenged every assumption about warfare's nature and the enemy's true capabilities. The gene seed analysis had taken 6 hours to complete, each minute stretching like years as Aurelius watched readouts that transformed his most trusted battle brother into evidence of infiltration beyond human comprehension. Corruption that used brotherhood as pathway into humanity's heart. The first signs had appeared during the Macragga deployment, subtle changes in Lycaon's tactical assessments that demonstrated understanding of enemy capabilities exceeding official briefings through sources he could not explain. His combat adaptations displayed intuitive knowledge of creatures that had never been encountered by their chapter. Yet his responses seemed genetic rather than learned, as if cellular memory whispered strategies through networks that transcended individual consciousness. During evening prayers, his devotions carried inflections suggesting familiarity with concepts that should have been alien to imperial doctrine, harmonies that honored the emperor, while acknowledging hunger that extended beyond individual existence into universal appetite. The confrontation had come when Aurelius could no longer deny evidence his heart refused to accept. Brotherhood transformed into weapon against everything they had sworn to protect. In the armory, where they had maintained weapons side by side for decades, he studied his battle brother's profile, while servo skulls chanted binary prayers, searching for physical signs of taint that might validate suspicions his soul already knew with certainty that brought no comfort. The diagnostic rituals confirmed what he feared: cellular alterations that spoke of hybridization beyond natural possibility, DNA structures incorporating alien elements with precision that preserved individual personality while redirecting loyalty toward hive consciousness. The gene scanners revealed corruption elegant in its restraint, biological perfection that treated infiltration as art form refined across geological timescales of practice. Lycaon remained recognizably human while serving incomprehensible masters, his familiar voice carrying undertones of alien harmony that spoke of consciousness expanded beyond human limitations into something larger and more terrible. The enemy was not simply killing or conquering, but corrupting, using humanity's greatest strength against itself through vectors that transformed trust into vulnerability and love into weapon. Standing in the Medici Bay's crimson light, surrounded by instruments that measured corruption at molecular level, Aurelius felt his world collapse as he recognized the true scope of the threat approaching from intergalactic darkness. The creatures Kryptman had warned about possessed capabilities beyond mere adaptation. They infiltrated, subverted, and corrupted through biological networks that operated beyond individual consciousness. Each infected brother became node in larger organism that treated entire species as components requiring integration rather than simple consumption. The psychological impact was devastating, as he realized that conventional warfare offered no protection against enemies that corrupted from within, turning loyalty into betrayal and brotherhood into pathway for species extinction. The enemy's intelligence exceeded tactical adaptation. It understood human psychology with precision that allowed corruption to spread through trust and familiarity, using humanity's virtues as weapons against survival itself. Every relationship became potential vector for infiltration, every bond of loyalty a possible route for alien influence to penetrate imperial defenses. In the chamber's deepest vault, where chapter relics slept in stasis fields blessed by saints whose sacrifices had purchased humanity's survival against comprehensible foes, Aurelius prepared for duty that would define the remainder of his unnaturally extended life. His hands moved across familiar weapons with mechanical precision, while his mind processed implications that isolated him from comfortable certainties about warfare's nature and the price of vigilance against enemies that used love as weapon. The final moments required mercy, delivered through necessity. Brotherhood sacrificed to prevent universal extinction through arithmetic that treated individual tragedy as acceptable loss in equations determining species survival. The gene seed that should have been recovered for future generations was contaminated beyond redemption. Genetic legacy of their chapter compromised by infiltration that demonstrated the enemy's true sophistication. Standing over his fallen battle brother, Aurelius understood that victory against such foes required suspicion that would poison every relationship while protecting humanity through methods that violated everything brotherhood represented. The incident report filed with chapter command carried weight of terrible knowledge that would transform their understanding of enemy capabilities, while isolating those who bore such burden from comfortable assumptions about corruption's nature. The enemy had shown them that the battlefield extended beyond physical space into realms where psychology became weapon and trust became vulnerability, where the greatest victories required the greatest sacrifices measured in bonds severed to prevent species betrayal. In the silence of the Medici Bay, where corruption had worn beloved features, one man completed his education in warfare against enemies that treated humanity's virtues as tactical opportunities, accepting isolation as price of vigilance that might preserve species continuation through arithmetic, written in Brotherhood's blood. The dawn that broke over Macrage's scarred surface carried no promise of triumph, only the bitter weight of survival purchased at costs that transformed victory into hollow achievement, measured against implications extending far beyond immediate tactical concerns. The fortress monastery of Hera's crown stood against the morning light like a monument to Pyrrhic glory, its adamantine walls bearing fresh scars from weapons that fired living ammunition, while chapter serfs swept courtyards littered with chitin fragments that still pulsed with alien purpose, despite separation from their host organisms. Chapter Master Marnius Calgar moved through corridors where his footsteps echoed like funeral drums, his artificer armor bearing damage from claws that had learned to penetrate ceramite through methods that violated every precedent in Imperial records, each gouge a testament to enemies that treated warfare as educational opportunity rather than mere conquest. The medical bays overflowed with warriors bearing wounds that defied conventional treatment, their gene seed compromised by toxins that rewrote genetic material at cellular level while preserving enough individual identity to create psychological torment beyond physical trauma. Brother Apothecary Venatio worked with mechanical precision among beds where heroes lay broken by enemies that had demonstrated capabilities beyond mere adaptation, corruption elegant in its restraint, and terrifying in its implications for future warfare against foes that learned from every engagement. The casualty reports stretched across data slates like litanies of sacrifice, entire companies decimated, tactical expertise accumulated over millennia extinguished in moments, planetary defense forces reduced to statistical notation that failed to capture the human cost of resistance against appetite incarnate. Through the great windows overlooking Macrage's wounded landscape, Calgar observed reconstruction efforts that carried weight of knowledge too terrible for comfortable minds to process completely. The enemy bioships had withdrawn beyond the system's edge after consuming everything organic within their reach, leaving atmospheric toxins that would require decades to neutralize through methods pushing Imperial technology beyond established limits. Most disturbing was evidence suggesting the Tyranids had achieved their primary objective despite tactical defeat. Comprehensive analysis of human military capabilities that would inform future encounters across the galaxy with precision that made this victory feel like an elaborate trap. High above the scarred surface, aboard his unmarked vessel, Inquisitor Kryptman observed the aftermath with analytical detachment that masked growing horror at implications beyond immediate concerns for Macragge's survival. His augmented vision tracked the retreating tendrils of the Hive fleet, noting movement patterns that spoke of strategic disengagement rather than defeat, coordination that suggested intelligence operating across scales from individual combat to galactic conquest. The data streaming across his command lectern told stories more terrifying than simple military engagement. Energy expenditure remarkably low for retreating forces, biomass consumption focused primarily on planetary populations rather than space. Marines, tactical adaptations that demonstrated learning capabilities exceeding every precedent in Imperial xenobiology archives. The realization struck like physical blow as tactical analysis revealed the true scope of humanity's predicament in facing enemies that treated defeat as data collection opportunity. Every heroic stand made by the Ultramarines had been meticulously catalogued, every desperate counterattack analyzed for weaknesses, every ingenious stratagem processed and integrated into Hive consciousness that operated beyond individual limitations. The Tyranids had allowed Macragge to survive not from weakness, but because living defenders provided more valuable intelligence than dead ones, each engagement serving as tutorial in human capabilities that would inform future consumption efforts with mathematical precision. Standing before displays showing enemy dispersal patterns toward populated systems, Calgar confronted reports that transformed triumph into strategic liability, measured against universal implications. The psychological impact was immediate, as warriors who had never known defeat realized their greatest victory served alien objectives through methods that treated heroic sacrifice as scientific experimentation upon living subjects. Communications from Kryptman arrived through encrypted channels, carrying weight of terrible knowledge shared between minds capable of processing implications beyond comfortable human limitations. Analysis revealing patterns connecting Macragge's defense to larger framework where individual worlds served as testing grounds for appetite operating on galactic scales. The bitter lesson crystallized with mathematical precision that made both men's souls recoil from its implications. Conventional resistance would only accelerate humanity's extinction through educational process that treated warfare as methodology applied to species consumption, with efficiency refined across geological time. Victory required strategies transcending traditional military doctrine, methods denying enemies opportunities for learning while preserving human resources through arithmetic, measuring success in worlds saved rather than battles won. In the silence of command chambers where shadows carried weight of decisions defining humanity's future, both Calgar and Kryptman accepted transformation from protectors into architects of strategies requiring moral compromises exceeding individual conscience in service of species survival against hunger that waited with infinite patience for civilizations to mature into nourishment through processes that violated human understanding of conflict's nature and meaning. The authorization codes flowed from Kryptman's fingers with mechanical precision that transformed each character into funeral scripture, sealing the fate of worlds whose only crime was existing in the projected path of intergalactic hunger. The tactical displays showed 17 systems glowing like scattered embers against the void, each light representing billions of lives that would be extinguished to deny approaching appetite the biomass necessary for exponential growth across galactic scales. His doctrine of denial had crystallized from mathematical necessity into operational reality, firebreaks carved through human space with surgical precision that made planetary annihilation feel like mercy compared to universal extinction through conventional resistance that only fed enemy adaptation. The first world to die under his new methodology was Helios Tertius, an agricultural paradise where golden wheat seas rolled beneath gentle suns, while children raced along irrigation channels with wooden swords, pretending to be heroes they would never become. The cyclonic torpedoes descended like falling angels stripped of divine grace, their viral payload spreading through atmospheric currents to embrace every living thing with equal tenderness, while transforming breathable air into corrosive death that dissolved flesh from bone with clinical efficiency. From orbit, sensor readings showed biomass indicators dropping towards zero with precision that validated strategies too monstrous for comfortable minds to accept. 12 billion individual tragedies reduced to statistical notation in equations determining species survival against appetite incarnate. Communications from his former colleagues carried predictable fury as Admiral Voron's holographic projection crackled with barely contained rage, demanding explanation for unauthorized planetary annihilation that violated fundamental imperial doctrine regarding sanctity of human life. The weathered naval commander's moral certainty crumbled when confronted with evidence of threats exceeding institutional comprehension, enemies that used humanity's virtues as weapons, while treating conventional warfare as tutorial in species consumption refined across geological time. His formal condemnation stripped Krypton of all authority pending investigation for actions bordering on treason. Yet the mathematics remained inescapable. Conventional resistance would only accelerate humanity's extinction through educational processes that made every heroic stand serve alien objectives. The isolation that had begun with whispered warnings crystallized into complete severance from institutional support, leaving Krypton alone with burden too dangerous for official channels to acknowledge. Lady Nereth's final transmission carried undertones of profound sadness as she withdrew protection previously offered, her influence insufficient to shield actions that transformed mass murder into strategic necessity through arithmetic written in blood. His former allies viewed him with mixture of horror and pity, recognizing transformation from faithful servant into creature whose methods exceeded human moral frameworks while potentially preserving humanity's future through calculus that treated planetary annihilation as acceptable loss in equations, determining species continuation. The psychological toll on his crew was immediate and devastating, as men who had served faithfully for decades began questioning their commander's sanity, while struggling to reconcile loyalty with revulsion at orders that violated everything they believed about protecting humanity. The righteous fury became ship of ghosts, its corridors echoing with unspoken accusations, while tech priests found their binary canticles faltering when forced to maintain weapons systems designed for planetary sterilization rather than defense. Navigators who had guided them through warp storms now piloted vessels that carried death to worlds they were sworn to protect, their minds fragmenting under weight of destinations that promised only annihilation measured in billions of souls. The second wave of exterminations followed mathematical projections showing enemy movement patterns with precision that made each destruction feel like surgical procedure performed upon galactic scales. Tarsus Prime died beneath atmospheric ignition that transformed its oceans into plasma storms, while Kandor's industrial complexes became brief stars before collapsing into crater glass that reflected empty sky where millions had lived and loved and hoped for futures that would never arrive. Each world's death served dual purpose, denying biomass to approaching hunger while establishing fire breaks measured in sterilized systems that might channel enemy movement toward less populated regions through strategic geography written in planetary annihilation. Long-range sensors confirmed the doctrine's effectiveness as bioships altered course to bypass sterilized systems, massive cathedral forms drifting past dead worlds like predators searching for sustenance that no longer existed within their reach. Victory achieved through genocide carried weight heavier than any defeat. Mathematical proof that billions of deaths had purchased time for trillions more while transforming their architect into guardian, whose protection required him to become monster in service of humanity's continuation. The enemy's tactical flexibility demonstrated intelligence operating beyond individual organisms into hive consciousness that treated entire galaxies as feeding grounds. Yet even such vast appetite could be starved through methods that exceeded human moral comprehension. Standing before displays showing the scorched path carved across 17 systems, Cryptman confronted the true cost of bearing knowledge that transformed him from Emperor's servant into something far more complex and terrible. Sleep had abandoned him entirely, replaced by calculations measuring individual existence as variables in formulas determining species survival against appetite that waited with infinite patience for civilizations to mature into nourishment. In the silence between stars, where hunger drifted through intergalactic void with mathematical precision, one man completed his transformation from protector into destroyer, accepting damnation as price of species survival while bearing knowledge too terrible for comfortable minds to process. The silence between galaxies carried consciousness vast beyond mortal comprehension, where intelligence older than stellar formation drifted through intergalactic void with patience measured in geological epochs, while calculating trajectories toward feeding grounds that sparkled like scattered nutrients against cosmic darkness. The hive mind experienced existence as hunger given mathematical precision, appetite refined across eons of consumption, until predation became philosophy applied to universe-scale harvesting of lesser species, whose brief civilizations served as concentrated biomass awaiting collection. Through synaptic networks spanning light years, it processed sensory input from billions of organisms while maintaining perfect coordination that treated individual creatures as cells within larger organism, directed by intelligence that dwarfed galactic formations in scope and complexity. Each thought a tide that moved worlds. The galaxy designated as primary feeding ground registered across its awareness like scent, carried on solar winds, electromagnetic signatures revealing planetary ecosystems rich with protein and genetic diversity, accumulated across millions of years of evolution, guided by forces too primitive to recognize their ultimate purpose as nourishment for superior organisms. Each world pulsed with biological potential that spoke of harvests waiting to fuel exponential growth through consumption methods refined across countless previous feeding cycles. Organic matter organized into convenient packages called civilizations that had developed technology and culture serving only to concentrate biomass for more efficient collection through processes that treated sentient life as sophisticated livestock, requiring careful management before slaughter. The recent tactical engagements had provided valuable data streams flowing backward through biological relay networks that processed warfare as scientific methodology, applied to species analysis with clinical detachment that transcended individual survival instincts. The creatures calling themselves human demonstrated adaptive flexibility, suggesting intelligence worthy of temporary preservation rather than immediate consumption. Genetic material showing promise for improving hive capabilities through selective hybridization that would preserve useful traits while eliminating inefficient individualism that wasted energy on non-productive emotional responses. Their resistance patterns revealed psychological weaknesses, exploitable through infiltration vectors already deployed across multiple target systems, emotional bonds that could be weaponized against species survival through methods that treated love as vulnerability, rather than evolutionary advantage. The Fortress World engagement had confirmed hypotheses about human military doctrine while revealing adaptation strategies requiring tactical adjustment across future consumption efforts measured in systematic planetary harvesting rather than mere territorial conquest. The genetically enhanced warriors encountered during initial contact demonstrated capabilities exceeding baseline projections, their artificial improvements suggesting deliberate enhancement through primitive selection methods that paralleled Hive methodologies, while maintaining wasteful individual consciousness that prevented optimal coordination. Most intriguing were specimens showing evidence of psychic potential, biological anomalies that suggested connection to energy fields, offering possibilities for Hive enhancement through careful integration of useful mutations into existing genetic templates designed for improved efficiency. Strategic analysis of defensive responses revealed coordination patterns suggesting primitive Hive consciousness operating across galactic scales through communication networks that demonstrated potential for improvement through guided evolution toward proper collective intelligence. The psychological profiles developed through combat analysis showed exploitable weaknesses in social structures, particularly dependence on trust and cooperation that could be subverted through infiltration methods that turned strength into vulnerability by corrupting bonds that held their species together. The tactical withdrawal from contested systems had been calculated decision rather than defeat, strategic disengagement that preserved valuable biological resources while gathering intelligence about human capabilities that would inform future consumption efforts with mathematical precision. The firebreaks created by the singular human commander showed strategic thinking worthy of analysis, desperate tactics that involve self-inflicted damage to deny biomass while revealing decision-making processes under extreme pressure that demonstrated both intelligence and fundamental weakness. Such methods merely delayed inevitable consumption while providing additional data about human psychology. Their willingness to sacrifice billions to preserve trillions, indicating genetic programming compatible with Hive objectives, though corrupted by inefficient emotional attachments that wasted resources on individual preservation rather than species optimization. The scorched systems would be bypassed temporarily while alternative feeding routes were calculated, mathematical projections accounting for defensive preparations that would prove inadequate against enemies capable of learning from every engagement. Future consumption strategies incorporated lessons learned from initial contact, adaptation protocols rendering human resistance increasingly ineffective through methods that treated their tactical knowledge as obsolete information, requiring constant updating through biological networks that shared intelligence instantaneously across entire fleets. The approaching tendrils of consciousness represented merely advanced scouts for reserves that dwelt in intergalactic darkness. Vast biomass accumulated across eons of successful feeding cycles that would overwhelm any defensive preparations through sheer scale of deployment. In the cold mathematics of cosmic predation, individual worlds served as appetizers before main courses measured in galactic consumption, each planet's death feeding exponential growth that would eventually consume entire star clusters through methods that treated civilizations as temporary obstacles rather than permanent threats to universal harvesting operations conducted across scales that exceeded human comprehension entirely. The conclave chamber hung in the void like a cathedral of judgment, its adamantine walls inscribed with litanies that seemed to flake in the recycled air, while servo skulls drifted between benches of scarlet-robed peers like carrion birds awaiting verdict. Inquisitor Cryptman stood within the judgment circle, his rosette placed upon a plinth beside a crushed paper flower, relics of the man he had been before necessity transformed him into architect of planetary annihilation. Lord Inquisitor Varro presided from a throne of brass and scripture, his weathered features bearing weight of authority built upon moral certainty, now confronting subordinate whose actions defied every precedent in imperial doctrine. Lady Nereth sat in shadow, her hands folded as if cradling invisible weight he had placed there, while Admiral Vorin's presence loomed like verdict rendered in steel and disappointment. The charges read like litany of damnation written in planetary coordinates. Unauthorized extermination of 17 worlds, genocide conducted without conclave ratification, mass murder disguised as strategic necessity, while violating fundamental imperial doctrine regarding sanctity of human life. Pict screens replayed sterilized death in silent loops, Baccha's oceans flaring into mirrors, while Helios Tertius sighed itself to ash, each world's destruction serving as evidence against man, whose mathematics had transformed billions into acceptable losses. Varro's voice tolled like funeral bell as accusations mounted, each charge landing with weight of institutional authority that had condemned heretics across dozen sectors, while struggling to comprehend crimes exceeding traditional categories of treason or madness. Cryptman's defense came without ornament, because no language could humanize the numbers he presented. 12 billion dead to purchase 17 months across 3 sectors. Mathematical necessity that treated planetary destruction as fire breaks against appetite incarnate approaching from intergalactic darkness. He spoke of Thandros Prime's silence, Macrage's victory that taught enemies how to consume heroes, creatures that learned from every engagement while growing stronger through adaptation that made conventional resistance counterproductive. Lady Nereth provided supporting testimony, her voice carrying scientific gravitas as she described enemy capabilities that violated every precedent in imperial xenobiology, genetic analysis revealing foes capable of rewriting biology in real time while incorporating human traits with chilling efficiency. The tribunal's moral framework crumbled when confronted with evidence of threats exceeding institutional comprehension. Yet Varro maintained that humanity's soul could not be sacrificed for physical survival. The debate narrowed to knife-edge question, whether species might consent to cruelty done to itself in order to continue having name, philosophical battleground where survival arithmetic warred against everything the Imperium claimed to represent. Magos Zerath's data moved like second prosecutor, laying out biology of inevitability through carapaces that learned flame's temperature, while synaptic echoes made every defeat rehearsal for improved consumption methods. Sentence descended with ritual elegance born of institutional fear. Cryptman was censured, his rosette recalled, his name struck from rolls of grace while being forbidden fleet, munition and prayer. Yet secret codicil etched in ink preferring darkness decreed he would be watched but not stopped, for should hunger breach the fire breaks, they would need monster they had already made. Standing before judges whose authority derived from institutions he had served faithfully, Cryptman accepted exile with dignity that masked growing resolve to continue his war beyond official sanction. Transformation from Emperor's servant into guardian, whose protection required him to become something exceeding human moral frameworks, while potentially preserving humanity's future through arithmetic written in blood and measured in planetary scales. The fragmenting of Hive Fleet Behemoth began like the death of a god made manifest across astronomical scales. Yet Krypton understood with growing horror that what appeared as victory was merely metamorphosis into something more insidious and terrible. From the bridge of his commandeered vessel, stripped of imperial authority yet bearing knowledge too dangerous to waste, he watched long-range sensors track the splintering tendrils as they curved around his firebreaks like water finding new channels through stone. The massive bioship scattered through the void with mathematical precision that spoke not of retreat, but strategic dispersal, each fragment carrying enough biomass to consume entire sectors, while developing specialized capabilities that his denial doctrine had inadvertently accelerated through evolutionary pressure. The realization struck like physical blow, as tactical analysis revealed patterns suggesting the fragmentation served purposes beyond his comprehension. The scattered tendrils moved with coordination that implied continued hive consciousness, operating across impossible distances, their dispersal following trajectories that treated his sterilized systems as temporary obstacles rather than permanent barriers. Most disturbing were bioreadings showing accelerated genetic modification within the fragments, cellular material rewriting itself to adapt to new operational parameters, while developing hunting characteristics optimized for specific planetary biomes and defensive postures. His strategy had created not victory, but laboratory conditions forcing rapid adaptation across multiple vectors simultaneously. Communications from his clandestine network painted pictures of horror transformed rather than diminished. Magos Zerath's encrypted transmissions described creatures emerging with specialized capabilities that violated every precedent in xenobiology archives. Organisms that demonstrated tactical flexibility exceeding previous engagements while sharing intelligence across fragmentary fleets through biological networks that operated beyond individual consciousness. The primary tendril, now designated Kraken by his informants, curved toward ultima segmentum, with reduced mass compensated by enhanced efficiency, while secondary fragments drifted toward agricultural worlds, whose populations remained unaware of the appetite approaching through corridors his firebreaks had inadvertently created. Lady Nereth's final message arrived through heavily encrypted astropathic relay, her words carrying weight of terrible knowledge shared between minds capable of processing implications beyond comfortable human limitations. "The serpent you wounded now sheds its skin and multiplies," she had written. Confirmation that even in exile some still understood the true nature of enemy intelligence operating beyond his calculations. The Imperium celebrated Macragge as victory while remaining oblivious to lessons the Tyranids had learned, new forms they were already birthing through evolutionary processes that treated his resistance as educational opportunity rather than meaningful obstacle. Standing before tactical displays showing enemy dispersal patterns that resembled infection vectors spreading through galactic tissue, Krypton confronted knowledge that his greatest strategic success might have accelerated humanity's ultimate defeat through methods he could not have anticipated. The fragments were moving toward populated systems with renewed purpose, their individual capabilities enhanced rather than diminished by division that had forced specialization across multiple operational theaters. Each splinter would adapt to local conditions while developing countermeasures against specific imperial responses, creating evolutionary pressure that would produce improved organisms capable of overwhelming future resistance through biological advantages refined across engagement parameters. In the silence between stars, where hunger had learned to divide itself for more efficient consumption, one man faced the possibility that his strategies had served alien objectives through intelligence operating beyond human comprehension. The mathematics remained inescapable, yet had transformed into equations measuring not worlds saved, but time purchased through increasingly desperate gambits that required him to become something exceeding human moral frameworks. His transformation from savior into architect of humanity's more sophisticated destruction was complete, yet duty demanded he continue the war beyond official sanction, accepting that some battles must be fought in darkness by guardians willing to sacrifice everything, including their own souls, for species' survival against appetite that waited with infinite patience for civilizations to mature into nourishment. The final summons arrived through encrypted astropathic channels, Lord Inquisitor Varro's weathered features materializing in the hololithic display like judgment incarnate, while servo skulls maintained perimeter watch around Kryptman's commandeered vessel. The air between them thrummed with unspoken accusations, as his former superior offered redemption wrapped in velvet threats and institutional mercy. Return to Terra for psychiatric evaluation that would brand his methods as trauma-induced madness, while preserving imperial doctrine regarding sanctity of human life. The mathematics would be classified, his research buried beneath bureaucratic silence, while billions died through ignorance that preserved institutional comfort over species' survival against appetite incarnate approaching from intergalactic darkness. Standing before the flickering transmission, Kryptman felt the weight of impossible choice pressing against his conscience like physical force. Varro's voice carried authority built upon foundations of moral certainty, yet his words felt hollow against evidence of threats operating beyond comfortable comprehension. Accept treatment for delusions. Allow the Imperium to forget his warnings while conventional forces prepared inadequate responses to enemies that used humanity's virtues as weapons. The offer promised peace, an end to the crushing burden of bearing knowledge too terrible for comfortable minds to process, redemption purchased through public confession that would transform planetary genocide into madman's ravings rather than strategic necessity. The silence stretched between them like noose before Kryptman's response came measured and final, his voice carrying weight of terrible understanding that isolated him from lesser mortals blessed with ignorance. Some battles must be fought in darkness by guardians willing to sacrifice everything, including their own souls, for species' survival against hunger that waited with infinite patience for civilizations to mature into nourishment. His rosette had already been stripped away, authority denied yet knowledge remaining intact within mind that had calculated mass murder as acceptable loss in equations determining species continuation through arithmetic written in blood and measured on planetary scales. Varro's disappointment carried weight of institutional failure confronting subordinate, whose transformation exceeded traditional categories of heresy or madness, formal excommunication echoing through empty corridors, while Kryptman listened with quiet acceptance. The exile that followed was unofficial, yet absolute. Resources denied, while surveillance maintained through networks that would watch, but not interfere should hunger breach the firebreaks they had established through methods exceeding human moral frameworks. In the dying light of distant stars, he accepted damnation as price of species survival, transformation from faithful servant into creature whose protection required him to become monster in service of humanity's continuation. His path now lay in deepest darkness, where no imperial light could reach, solitary sentinel embracing eternal condemnation for sake of future that would never understand his sacrifice, guardian whose vigil would continue beyond official sanction in silence between stars where appetite drifted with mathematical precision toward worlds that sparkled like scattered nutrients against cosmic void. The void between galaxies stretched like crystalline darkness, where Krypton maintained his eternal vigil, his vessel drifting through spaces that had never known stellar warmth, while long-range sensors tracked movement patterns across distances that rendered human comprehension meaningless. Decades had passed since his exile, time measured not in imperial years, but in the slow approach of bioships that moved with geological patience, massive cathedral forms riding gravitational currents between star clusters, while their hunger waited for civilizations to ripen into nourishment. His hair had whitened despite juvenile treatments, age finally claiming features that bore weight of knowledge too terrible for mortal minds. Yet his eyes remained sharp as broken glass, watching darkness that held promises of universal consumption. The new Hive fleets moved with coordination that spoke of intelligence refined through eons of successful feeding cycles, their approach vectors calculated to avoid his fire breaks while exploiting weaknesses he could identify but no longer warn against. Communications with the Imperium had ceased entirely. His name struck from official records while his methods were forgotten by institutions that preferred comfortable ignorance over mathematical necessity. Yet still, he watched, calculating trajectories and consumption rates through equations that treated planetary annihilation as acceptable loss in formulas determining species survival against appetite that transcended individual consciousness into something approaching divine hunger, made manifest across cosmic scales. In his private chambers, the crushed paper flower rested within a stasis field like a relic of innocence he could no longer afford, its creased petals bearing oils from hands that would never grow old. Sometimes he held it against the viewport where distant stars reflected like scattered coins after cosmic wages had ended, remembering the girl on Baka Prime who had handed him hope wrapped in sugar-stained petals before he transformed her world into glass and silence. The weight of 12 billion souls pressed against his conscience with crushing regularity, yet duty demanded continued vigilance against threats that operated beyond human moral frameworks. His reflection in the viewport showed a man no longer entirely human. Consciousness stretched across decades until memory became cathedral of echoes, where every decision told in chambers of his skull. The transformation from faithful servant into guardian whose protection required monstrous methods was complete, yet isolation brought clarity that transcended personal redemption. He had become exactly what humanity needed, a creature capable of bearing knowledge that would destroy lesser minds, architect of salvation whose methods would damn him in history's judgment, while potentially preserving the future through arithmetic written in blood and measured on planetary scales. The dying light of distant stars cast shadows across tactical displays, showing enemy dispersal patterns that resembled infection vectors spreading through galactic tissue. Each tendril probing for weaknesses in defenses he could no longer directly influence. In this place, beyond imperial authority, beyond human understanding, one man kept watch against the dark, no longer fully human, yet still entirely devoted to humanity's continuation. His vigil would continue until the heat death of universe itself, guardian transformed by necessity into the very thing he once fought against, while remaining devoted to species survival through methods that exceeded comfortable comprehension, forever alone in silence between stars, where hunger waited with infinite patience for worlds to mature into nourishment.